Hello, everybody. Sending out invites. There's Kelsey.
Hello.
Good to see you.
Good to see you as always.
We'll wait a minute for Brian or RL. I'm not sure what she prefers to go by to join us. Oh, there he is. Good. Hello. I'm seeing other faces pop up. This is great. Let's see. Oops. All right. Hi, everybody. This is great. Okay. He should. We've never tried with more than us.
I'm pretty sure we can do this with 3 people, right? Am I wrong?
Supposed to be 4 people, so I just accepted. Let me try again.
Okay.
Hopefully his face pops up here when some requests to join. Okay,
there it is.
Hello.
Uh-oh. Yes.
Oh.
Hi.
Hello. Good. Success.
Hi.
Okay.
Hi. I'm in my car. Sorry.
Thank you for joining us.
Absolutely.
Have a few more people pop in while we do this.
Hey, I'm going to mute myself for a minute. I've got a 4-year-old pounding on my door.
Sure.
I'm going to get him situated.
I'll
be right back.
Okay.
Sorry. Hold on just a second.
Sure. Now, do you prefer to go by Ryan or RL?
Ryan.
Ryan is fine. Oh, okay, good, because I see. And I'm going to hold up your book here for those joining us. This is Ryan's book that came out this fall. I just finished it this week, finally. Over to you. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So thankful you wrote it. I was wondering if you could begin by maybe telling us a little bit about your work, a little bit about your background, your whatever you'd like to share to kind of introduce yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. First, thank you for having me. Great to be here. This is my first Instagram Live too. So hopefully the technology on my end works out fine. But yeah, my name is Ryan Stollar, and I am a child advocate and a child liberation theologian. I have spent most of my career working to create safer faith communities and homeschooling communities for children. I was raised by conservative evangelical parents, and I was homeschooled for kindergarten through high school graduation. And while I had a generally positive homeschooling experience, I did see a lot of friends who had negative experiences, who experienced abuse or neglect. And so when I became an adult, I created an organization called Homeschoolers Anonymous, and that organization provided a platform for my homeschooled peers to share about their experiences growing up in the evangelical homeschooling world. And while I was running that organization, I felt like I needed to be better equipped to advocate for my friends and peers. And so I went back to school and got a master's in child protection. And it was while I was studying for that master's that I was continually being confronted with this problem, which was that so much of what I grew up with in conservative evangelicalism in terms of what I was taught were best practices for parenting and taking care of children and advocating for children was in diametric opposition to everything I was learning were the best practices for child protection and child development. And so that got me thinking about the question of, is there a different way that we can think about God and the Bible and Jesus and Christianity in a way that is empowering and helpful for children, as opposed to what I experienced so much growing up, which was my faith being used to control children or force them into this mold that adults want them to be. And so my initial thought was liberation theology. Well, I was raised in a conservative home and went to a conservative college. I was introduced to liberation theology in college, and I fell in love with it, even as a conservative college student. I really liked how it emphasizes putting your faith into practice to try to make the world a better place. And so I thought, I wonder if there's a liberation theology for children. I know that there were lots of different types of liberation theologies for different groups of people, but I was not familiar if there was one for children specifically. And so I researched it, didn't find anything except for one book from 1991, a book called Suffer the Children by Janet Peiss. And that book blew my mind and transformed a lot of the ways I think about God and the Bible in relation to children. And so I really wanted to kind of bring that conversation about child liberation theology forward for the next generation and kind of update a lot of what Janet Peiss talked about in her 1991 book. So that's a very long introduction, but hopefully
yeah,
that
no, this
covers
is
the
great.
bases.
It's great to hear your background and some of the inspiration for the book. How would you, if you had to encapsulate liberation theology categorically in a couple sentences, because sometimes we got a few questions, a few comments, a few does this mean liberate children from their parents? Or for some people, there can be like a knee-jerk response, like, is this communist? Is this Marxist? There's a lot of things floating around in the Christian culture sphere about liberation theology. So anyway, how would you kind of offer that up to someone who's really not familiar with it generally, and then maybe how it relates, what's your thesis, how it relates to children?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about liberation theology is that there are a bunch of different types, and so it's very diverse and varied. I'd say the easiest way to describe it is that it is a theology of self-determination. And what I mean by that is that it is a theology that really hopes to enable different people groups to think about God and the Bible using their own questions and their own thoughts, and really being able to actualize their faith for themselves. There are liberation theologies for really any sort of people group you can think of. Liberation theology first started in America, a black theologian named James Cone. And then around the exact same year that James Cone was writing about black liberation theology, a Peruvian priest named Gustavo Gutierrez was writing a book called A Theology of Liberation. And these theologians and their books were very contextual and specific to, James Cone was writing about black people and Gustavo Gutierrez was writing about Latin American people and their struggles against abuse and oppression. But since they started writing about it, now there's all sorts of different types of liberation theologies. Some are Marxist, as you mentioned. Gustavo Gutierrez has some Marxist thought, but there's all sorts of different types, some which have nothing to do with that. Like there's a liberation theology for people with disabilities. There's liberation theologies for women or different nationalities even. There's a Korean liberation theology. And for me, child liberation theology is kind of at its core trying to think about how we can liberate children from the abuse and neglect that they experience in their everyday lives. So I'm not interested in, liberating children from their parents, as some people might think. I think that parents and other caretakers are really crucial to the task of liberating children from child abuse and neglect. They're also, primary contributors to those problems, but I think that child liberation theology is an opportunity and a challenge to really have a conversation about how can parents and other adults treat children in a better way, in a healthier and more respectful way.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. And I think something I found you did so remarkably well in your book was balancing this. Obviously with children, when you're talking about liberation theology, how to invite children to speak for themselves or give them space. But here we're adults having this conversation by de facto, and that's so tricky. And I loved how, for those of you who haven't read the book yet, each chapter kind of ends with this invitation, like how might adults intentionally, whether it's parents or Christian educators or people in churches or anyone, invite children to the table, not as like children in formation to adulthood, but children as they are with their inherent dignity. And I loved that. I appreciated that so much. One of the questions we've gotten a lot of variations of it from people wanting to hear your thoughts, particularly because you have such a background with child protection and safeguarding as well. A lot of parents, we did a series for a couple weeks on corporal punishment in Christian spaces. And a lot of parents asking, like, how do we as bystanders safeguard children in communities that a lot of Christian communities still greenlight corporal punishment or say parents are required to do it? Are there ways to advocate or protect children? You know, a mother wrote in about, you know, hearing from another child that her friend is getting a lot of spankings at home, or witnessing things, or being in churches that are teaching this from the pulpit. And just really wondering if you have anything from your professional background, what can we be doing to advocate for healthier communities that are safer for children?
Yeah, corporal punishment is a very tricky subject. I mean, just, you know, to be fully honest, I do consider it to be abusive, but I'm also aware of the fact that many people disagree, and the law right now, like in the United States and all 50 states, does allow for corporal punishment. And then there's also the trickier part of, like, there are good and well-meaning people who use corporal punishment, but at the same time, I still do think that it is abusive. But how do you communicate that? I mean, that's the tricky part. Like, you know, I grew up being spanked by my parents. You know, I have nieces and nephews that have experienced corporal punishment too, and it's not always the most effective thing to do to, like, go to those people and say, hey, I think what you're doing is abusive. At the same time, I do think that we need to be telling the truth about violence against children. And I think that, like, for me personally, I think the entry point for trying to have that conversation, I think, is to go to a different form of abuse that people tend to be more universally agreed upon. So in child protection, like, consent is a really important idea. And this is especially important in the context of teaching children about sexual abuse. You know, we teach children that they have the right to say no to touch that makes them feel uncomfortable. You know, if someone wants to hug them, like, and they feel unsafe being hugged, then they have the right to say no. And I think that's something a lot of people agree on, whether they're liberal or conservative. It starts to get a little trickier in more conservative communities, but I think that they are coming around to the idea of children having some sort of right to bodily safety. I do know a lot of conservative communities where children are taught, like, you know, you can say no to a hug even if it's like your grandparent. You know, if the hug is making you feel unsafe or something. So I think that, like, starting with that sort of principle and then trying to expand it beyond the context of sexual abuse, because I think that, you know, if we're teaching children that they have the right to say no to touch that makes them feel unsafe or uncomfortable or painful or something like that, then it becomes really tricky in how you would communicate to a child that they have the right to say no to that, unless, you know, it's someone that's actually causing physical pain to them. That requires a lot of mental gymnastics in my mind, and really kind of highlights that this idea of consent and bodily safety really is important and really is applicable beyond just sexual abuse, and if you really take it to its kind of like full implications, it really challenges and questions Christians corporal punishment. The other thing that I would say about corporal punishment is that I would really encourage parents to look at the efficacy of it, like look at the scientific studies. You know, there are so many studies out there that says corporal punishment is damaging to children. It initiates the fight or flight response, which causes trauma to children, regardless of whether the spanking is mild or moderate or extreme. But I know that there's a lot of conservatives who kind of question that science, and so that's kind of tricky. But where I would go is with the efficacy, because the thing with corporal punishment is that even if it was causing damage to children, a lot of conservatives would still think that it's ultimately better in the long run to do it because that's what the Bible says. And so I've focused more on efficacy than those other issues, because corporal punishment, the science shows us that it is actually effective in getting short-term compliance from children. The problem is that it's not good at anything else besides short-term compliance. So what it's not teaching children is how to regulate their emotions. It's not teaching them right from wrong. It's very imprecise in what it teaches. It kind of depends on where the child is emotionally or physically or mentally, and what the parent's doing, exactly how they're spanking. So for me, if corporal punishment isn't even actually obtaining the goals that people say it's supposed to obtain, then I think that is a real reason for rejecting it. But I also think that I'll just say one more thing, which is that we have to be providing alternatives and resources to parents too. I mean, we can't just, the reason why a lot of people spank is it is very effective at that short-term compliance. And so when you're a parent and you are having a really stressful day and you're running out of resources, sometimes spanking is the most effective way to get what you want, and to get, you know, some sort of peace that you're hoping for. But in the end, if it's being ineffective and causing damage, then I think that we should be looking for alternatives, and giving people those alternatives is really important. We can't just, you know, take away one of their most effective tools. You have to give them other tools. And so acknowledging that parenting is really difficult, and that sometimes parents need a lot of different resources and tools to manage these situations, can be really key to helping them letting go of the more negative parenting techniques that they have.
That's good. And often I'll hear from parents that say what led them out of spanking was going through foster adoption training or child development or something that they realized they had other tools. One more thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to Kelsey. I know she has some specific questions too. So for also for parents who maybe are witnessing something in their churches, I know spanking is still legal in the United States. There's nothing like that. What is there anything concrete you could offer parents as far as if there's something? What are the guidelines if there's something they need to report? I know that gets so murky and so difficult. Or I heard some questions like that. How do we know? Do we just know this is going on? Certainly, maybe there's opportunity for conversation, but where would you say, oh, this is where people need to start talking about reporting, getting other services involved?
Yeah. Well, there's definitely like very precise definitions in terms of what is, you know, physical abuse versus corporal punishment. In general, like if a child has bruises or broken skin, that's going to be something that's criminal. And that's pretty consistent across the board. So, but that, I mean, your question raises a great point, which is, I think that churches and other faith communities really need to make sure that, you know, if they have child protection policies, that those are not just focused on sexual abuse, which is they often are. I think that they need to make sure that they are talking about all different types of abuse, including physical abuse. And that would mean that, you know, churches and faith communities need to take the time and effort to, you know, studying what their laws are in their state, and then defining for their community what would be the warning signs and what would be the signs that someone is going too far. I think it'd be great, of course, if faith communities could take a stand on this and really lead the way in saying that, all forms of physical violence against children are wrong. But at the very least, if they're not willing to go that far, I think that they need to be very clear so that their community members do know when someone should be reported or should be concerned about how a parent is physically treating their children. And again, for me, that would be like bruises or broken skin.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And,
Thank you.
And beyond that too, I think that, looking at signs of emotional abuse too. I mean, if a child is like flinching when a parent reaches for them, like that's an indication too that something is is going on.
Yeah, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go ahead and skim some of these comments while we switch gears a little bit, because we had another kind of topic that we got a lot of questions on. So Kelsey?
Yeah. So, some of the questions I'm interested in that come up in your book and that come up in some of my reporting too, it are along the lines of evangelical discomfort with the language of rights and autonomy in general, right?
Mm-hmm.
Everyone is sort of on board with protect children, right? Because protection can also be folded into other causes, whether it's pro-life advocacy or anti-sex trafficking advocacy, these things that are very sort of popular and have other uses within evangelicalism. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why there's so much discomfort with the language of liberation and rights. I mean, in your work with homeschooling as well, I assume this comes up quite a lot. How have you found success in articulating language of rights and liberation? And why do you think that's so hard for evangelicals to come to terms with talking about children as having their own rights and autonomy? Does that make sense? That's a very strange.
No, that's a great question. I think there's a lot of different reasons for that. I think that, like, for me, probably the most significant that I've encountered is that conservative evangelicals tend to have a certain perspective about authority and hierarchy and power, that those things tend to generally be good, and that anything that challenges, the way that God or life or the powers that be have structured the world is bad. So like in many conservative evangelical homeschooling communities, there's like the idea of the umbrella of authority or umbrella of protection. This is like a model of how the family, and sometimes even beyond the family, like how our world should be structured. And it's a chain of authority. So it usually starts off with God, and then under God is maybe like the pastor of the church. Under the pastor is the father, and then the father has power over the mother, because this is a patriarchal system usually, and then the mother has authority over the children. So each person has their place in this line of authority, and you're supposed to stay in your station. And if you move out of your station, then bad things can happen to you, or you create bad things for the family or your church or your community or whatever it may be. So I think that anything that really challenges that perspective is something that concerns a lot of conservative evangelicals. And I think once you start questioning whether those things are always good and start wondering and thinking about the way that people use power and authority over people who have less power and authority than they do, it really starts to challenge a lot of different aspects of your worldview. I'll give an example, and it won't be specific about children, but I think that uh, it shows kind of what's at stake, which is that, like, one thing that I've learned through my advocacy for children and for abuse survivors is the concept of power dynamics. So people having more power and authority when they are in a position over another person. And that when you have someone wielding power over another person, it makes a lot of things difficult, like consent, for example. And when you start to think about questions of consent, and then you look at the Bible, for example, there's all sorts of stories in the Bible where people that many conservative evangelicals consider biblical heroes do things that are wrong. When you have a biblical patriarch who has a relationship with an enslaved person, that makes consent very difficult. And so once you start seeing these questions of power dynamics and consent, you'll start to see that these are issues that are everywhere. And it really challenges our concepts of like who is good, who is righteous, what how we should be considering different people we consider heroes in the Bible. It really just shakes up a lot. And so I think that that's especially the case with children, and children are kind of the last frontier where, in general, our society thinks it is okay for people to have unchecked power over children. If you think of like any other relationship that involves power or authority, like as a society have come to a point in saying, usually at least, that like unchecked power is bad. So like in a marriage, like we now have no fault divorce. For government, we have checks and balances. We have labor unions. We have these different things that try to make sure that power is not focused just in one person or group, that it's spread out so that people can't take advantage of other people as easily. But when it comes to the parent-child relationship, in general, society does still believe that parents have the right to do with their children as they please, to some extent. We do have some limits on that, but parental rights is a pretty powerful and popular and unifying idea these days. And the idea behind that is essentially that, that the children are the property of their parents until they turn 18 or 21 or whatever the age may be. And so it's really this last area that I think that our society, and especially conservative evangelicals, see that power as being like an inherently good thing, as opposed to something that could so easily and is so easily used to abuse and hurt people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, and I think that a lot of evangelicals hold to a theological worldview that just holds so tightly onto this idea that the parent-child relationship does and is supposed to mirror the relationship between God and man. And that gets extrapolated in all different kinds of ways in parent-child relationships. Someone just sent me the other day, I've been kind of looking at some of these anecdotes, these really fearful anecdotes that get used to tell parents that they need to teach their children obedience. And someone told me that they've heard this story or this parable used over and over again. I don't know where it comes from, but that there's this shepherd with a sheep who keeps wandering off, and in order to teach the shepherd obedience, he breaks the lamb's leg until the lamb follows, and sort of extrapolates that that's how God relates to human. And there are all these really horrifying and I think a lot of times just made up ways that gets extrapolated and turned into a worldview in theology. And I wondered if you could speak to the ways that liberation theology really pushes back on that, because I know that, when James Cone writes about liberation theology, he just says, we have no interest in a theology that doesn't assume that Jesus is most concerned with liberating the oppressed, like as a first principle. And that really upends that way of thinking, that like God's primary way of relating to us has to do with his authority over us. So I just wondered if you could speak to how that kind of can upend some of these closely held ideas that we have.
Yeah. I think that, that's a really difficult one, because there are so many passages in the Bible that it does, depending on how you read it, it does sound like, there, well, I do think it's clear that there is supposed to be some sort of relationship between how God relates to humans and then parents relating to children. Like, there are many passages in the Bible that talk about that. And I think I'll just say real briefly as a side note, I think, though, that a way that child liberation theology challenges that is that God is not just a parent in the Bible. Like, God is also incarnated as a child. God identifies, or Jesus identifies as the Son of God repeatedly, as the child of God. And so I think that one way that we can kind of invert that way of thinking, of always associating God with parents, is to realize that God is child too, and that Jesus ultimately is the one, not God the Father, but Jesus, the child, is the one that comes and separates the sheep from the goats, and is the one that assumes power. I think the verse says, like holds the sword, and Jesus is the one that ultimately is providing judgment. And so, and Jesus is a child, so ultimately in the end, a child is going to be the one judging all of our adult sins. So I think that's an anecdote to that way of misthinking. But beyond that, I think that we have, this concept that like pain and abuse and violence can be good things if they are done with love. And I think that liberation theology really does challenge that. I think that if you are causing, harm or abuse to your neighbor, that is really kind of the heart of what sin is. Sin is like the dissolution of community between us and God and us and our neighbors. And so, like, when we are treating people as less than human, less than the images of God that they are, or justifying the ways that we mistreat each other, I think that is really at the heart of sin and injustice. And that's really what liberation theology is trying to get us to realize, is that that sin and injustice and all these things are not just abstract concepts that are about how we think or feel about God, but they're actually a day-to-day reality that relate to how we interact with one another. So I think that we really have to challenge the idea that, violence is a loving thing to give to children, or to anyone, really. I mean, we talk about and argue and debate about whether or not it's loving for a parent to, spank their child, but we wouldn't do that when it comes to a man and his wife. Like, we never make distinctions there. Or even with other types of abuse when it comes to children, like, with spanking, we make the distinction between spanking and like hitting. But with like sexual abuse, we don't say that, like, grooming is okay. Like, grooming's fine, but like, assault is bad. We understand that any part of that spectrum is mistreating someone else and treating them as less than the image of God that they are. And so I think really we have to transfer that and apply that to how we are, treating children physically as well.
Yeah, well, and I think that kind of comes back to this idea of children being valuable and whole as they are. It's like we're willing to use these very utilitarian approaches to child behavior because we're worried about the ends, because we see them as sort of not whole, not developed yet. We're very worried about what they're going to become, and anything that seems to move us in that direction is worth doing. We don't want to ask the question of the ethics of every little individual decision. Is it okay to spank? Is it okay to cause pain? Well, if that pain is in service of who we need our kid to turn out to be, because they aren't fully the person that they need to be, it becomes a little bit easier to be like very pragmatic and just jump over all of those ethical questions because of how we think of children as underdeveloped. And so I think
and also just, parenting can be really stressful and overwhelming sometimes. Like sometimes you don't have time for thinking about the ethics of your actions. But I think that, like, for me, I think it comes down to something really simple, though. It comes down to like the golden rule of like, if you were treating an adult the same the way that you're treating your child, like, would that adult feel like loved and respected, or would they feel controlled and patronized? And if your peer would feel either way, I would encourage parents to think about, like, why would you think that your child would feel differently? Like, they're equally human, and so they're going to have the same sort of emotions and responses. They won't have the same capabilities and resources per se because of their stage of child development, but they're still just as human. And so it's something that's going to make an adult feel disrespected or devalued is going to have the same effect for a child. And so I think we really need to keep that like at the forefront. Like, even if we don't have time to ask these questions of ethics, or if we have time to read a several 100-page book on theology, like, really keeping that in the forefront is that children are just as human as us. They just have not had as many experiences. They don't have as many resources as we as adults do. And so I think that really indicates that they deserve extra and special attention and protection because of that.
Yeah. And I think, I can just think of so many responses to that I've heard throughout this work that we've been doing. Things like, well, my parents did this and I'm glad they did, or my kids will thank me for this someday because they'll grow up to be better adjusted human beings, as if who they are now matters just so infinitely less than who they will be at 18 or 25 or something like that. It just is this way of utterly dismissing the value and the full lived experience of children, that their lived experience is no less real and vivid and like felt in their bodies the way that ours is. I think that there are just a lot of untruths that we sort of have absorbed and accepted as like common sense wisdom, like, of course our kids aren't going to thank us for discipline now, they'll thank us later. It's just this appeal. I can like almost hear someone like James Dobson saying that it's this kind of common sense, well, of course, they'll thank us when they're older kind of thinking. That at its root is just so utterly dehumanizing. But because we say it in this kind of dismissive way, the dehumanizing effect is just lost on us over time.
It's dehumanized, and I also think it's very untrue, and that goes back to the efficacy point earlier. Like, people are so diverse, and so we have very different responses to this exact same things. Like, it's great that maybe someone was spanked and they felt like they turned out okay, Like I was spanked and I literally sat in timeout every single time plotting how I would do the exact same thing without getting caught the next time. Like, and I know my experience is not alone. I wouldn't claim it's universal, but like some people when they are spanked, they easily align themselves with their parents' wills, and other people when they are spanked, it drives them farther away. And the fact that you don't know is for me like why that efficacy question is so important. Like if you're not 100% certain that using this risky act of violence against your child is going to get the exact result that you think or that you hope for, there's so much uncertainty there that I think it's not worth it in the end.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, I think that's right. And this all sort of makes me think of, you've mentioned a couple of times, like, parenting can be stressful. A lot of parents are sort of doing a lot of the things that they do almost just for lack of any other tools. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how like evangelical communities sometimes burden parents with this by giving this expectation that you have control of your children. It's not even just parents saying like, I must control my children. It's parents looking around and seeing people saying, why don't you have control over your children? And shrinking down acceptable child behavior being into this very narrow box of what is convenient for adults. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, what it might look like to cultivate communities where there is freedom for children to be, and acceptance of that, and encouraging adults to see kids that way as well. Because I think one piece that I'm always interested in is how do we help like adults within a community be okay with a wider range of children being visible and heard and active and participating. Because when I hear about kids, there was a comment earlier about seeing a child being spanked for being squirrely during a sermon. That tells me we are not creating communities where children are free to be there. So how do we fix that?
That's a great question, and I would say that that's an opportunity for like those of us who are religious or those who are like myself who have become more progressive and conservative to really think about communities beyond just the ones we're talking about, because like what you're describing, like that kind of dislike or frustration with children and their neediness and their loudness is not something that's unique to conservative evangelicals and their churches. Like that's something that is kind of widespread in society in general. Like I feel like every week on Twitter there's some argument about like some restaurant that said they're not going to allow children anymore, and then people say like that's discriminatory, and others say like, well, adults have the right to have child-free spaces and things like that. And so I think that like that kind of looking down on children and what they are and what they need happens everywhere. And I think that, that's really difficult to overcome. I think that the starting place is really to focus on the fact that children are equally human, and that I think that's the starting place for having some compassion and empathy towards children. Like they are just as human as us, but they don't have the same resources and the same capabilities and strengths that we have because they haven't had enough time to gather them and learn them. They're going to, because they are human. And so that's going to happen after a while, but it does take some time. And so I think we need to realize that like they're dealing with some really big things, and we don't know what's going on at home. Like when you see that kid at the store who throws a tantrum because they didn't get a candy bar, like it might have nothing to do with the candy bar. Maybe they have been really overwhelmed at home because their parents are going through a divorce, or maybe they got bullied at school. Like I think a lot of the kind of behaviors that we look down on children for having are like, especially things like what we call tantrums, are really just moments of emotional dysregulation where a child is experiencing something overwhelming, and the stimulus that they're encountering is more powerful than the resources that they currently have. And that's, I think, really important to understand about a tantrum, because I think a tantrum is probably like what we'd all put at the top as an example of like a child being willfully sinful or trying to manipulate their parents or be evil in some way. Like a tantrum is kind of like the epitome of all that. And I think that if we actually look at the science, though, like the tantrum is a perfectly normal part of child development. It is the result of the fact that like every child is born with a prefrontal cortex that needs to develop. And until that prefrontal cortex is developed and the child has gathered the skills of being able to regulate their emotions, they're going to have moments where life is more powerful than their skills. And so they melt down or get dysregulated or throw a tantrum. But if we, really keep in mind that this is a human being that is small and has not gathered the resources yet and is dealing with, the same things that we deal with in everyday life, that can be really challenging, and they don't have those skills. They don't have the freedom to, just say, I'm going to go home and take a nap. They have to rely on people to get home, to get their nap, and those sorts of things. I think it's, when you start to think about it, life is, very challenging and scary for us as adults. And so when you're a kid and you have those fewer resources, it's just even more so. So I think we really need to get to a place of being able to not just see them as equally human, but understand what that fully means for how they are engaging the world and how unique and challenging those experiences can be for them.
That's so good. I love how you phrased that. They're gathering the tools and skills. Yeah, I love that. Forward looking. Yeah. I'm wondering, today we're trying to be mindful of our time. We chronically go up an hour. So we're trying to be mindful of your time. I wonder if we have one more question. It's kind of switching topics a bit, but we did get a little bit of people asking about kind of how to recognize the vulnerability of children in faith spaces for spiritual instruction, that there's a potentially, there can be exploitative ways to offer children spiritual instruction because they desire connection, they are vulnerable. And so there was a really thoughtful question from someone who's a youth worker trying to think through that, like how do we offer spiritual instruction in ways that respect children's agency, but also recognize their participants and belonging in church communities or faith communities. And you do speak to that a little bit in your book. I wonder if there would be a little bit you could offer here as to things to keep in mind, ways to reconsider what feels normal to us, which is often like imparting a lot of cognitive knowledge. I don't know, I'm seeing the wheel on Ryan's end. He may have gotten frozen.
Ryan, are you frozen? Yeah, I think he is.
He might be frozen.
Yeah.
Well, hopefully he'll
if
come
he back up. We'll we lost him.
We lost him. Maybe he'll rejoin. I'll see.
We'll see
what rephrase it. This will, one way or another, keep us on traffic.
Maybe we will actually end at an hour this time.
Here, I'll try and re-add him again and see. Yeah, we will. I know you and I could probably still keep talking longer.
Yeah.
Some great comments, y'all. I hear some lovely people noting like children in churches are often especially taken to church during times when they're tired and hungry, or they have to sit and wait, or someone saying we deny children sensory needs because of adult sensory desires. That is powerful. Yeah. Oh, good. He's back. So we'll see. We'll see if this comes in again.
Okay.
Sometimes it takes a minute for it to trigger, but yeah, some great, if you're joining us, you can skim the comments, some great observations from people.
I love all these comments about just child development lacking. That's a thing that we observe all the time in the books that we're looking at, is just either just a complete ignoring of child development as a concern, or just kind of like we were saying earlier, just dismissing the validity of it as a state of being, just sort of saying like the underdevelopment of children is a deficiency, and therefore like we really only address it in terms of trying to fix it, or treating it as a symptom of sin, which I also think is strange.
Yeah.
You there?
Okay, you back. All right. Good. Good. So yeah, we were hoping for one more if we have time. We're trying to, I don't know when it froze out, but for one more kind of switching gears topic about how we respectfully navigate the vulnerability of children receiving spiritual instruction in Christian spaces, but also invite them to participate. So, and you speak to this a little bit in your book. You talk about baptism, dedication, and children engaging in visible roles in liturgical practices. But I wonder if you could kind of take that in whatever direction you would like how do we spiritually respect children's spirituality as well?
Yeah, I think that that question of vulnerability is really important. And I think that, like I talk in the book about the importance of pairing, like working on this child liberation project with making sure that your community has a robust child protection policy. And I think that, I think that every faith community, every organization that involves children should have a child protection policy. You should have something that is setting forth the principles of how you will be treating and interacting with children in a safe way, so that as you go about this process of, slowly and in stages, giving children increasingly more, opportunities to participate and access their communities, that as they're getting that increased freedom and responsibility and power even, that they are still remaining safe in their communities. Especially when you are giving children, increased responsibilities, that can help, lead to them feeling like, oh, I'm, now part of the adult world. And so they can feel like that's cool, and it is cool, but people can take advantage of them because of that. And so you want to make sure that you still have, safety in place in your community to make sure that that children are staying safe while having these increased opportunities. And I think there's, many ways to give children more access, like in the book I talk about, including them in all different aspects of their faith community, whether that's participating in the sacraments, or if it is actually leading things. And I think a question that people often have about child liberation, or liberating children in general, is like, you just let children do whatever they want, and that's not what it's really about. It's about scaffolding, which is like a teaching technique. It's about taking these like big and complex and what we would normally consider adult ideas or tasks, and breaking them down into small pieces so that children can actually understand and process what's going on. And that's applicable beyond faith communities. That's applicable to teaching children about any sort of big topic, whether it's, death, or if it's, sexual abuse prevention, or if it's current events like what's going on in Gaza right now. Like, when you explain these big topics to children, like making sure that you're not just overwhelming children, that you're actually making it so that children can understand and process what is going on in a safe and comfortable way.
Yeah, that's good. And relates to a little bit, maybe even that scaffolding concept is helpful for concerns over indoctrination the feel this youth worker who wrote in kind of was like, oh, how do we rethink, we're imparting, we are catechizing children in many faith communities, but how do we do that, how to balance that respectfully. So that's a really helpful term.
Yeah.
Thank you. Are there any last thoughts, Kelsey, or anything, Ryan, you would like to share, or anything you would hope we would have had a chance to talk about?
I'm just looking through these comments here, so go ahead.
I'll put up again, the book is available to purchase. I'll throw up a link when we put this in the show notes, as well as,
Cool.
Is there an audio version? I'm sure there's ebook, print.
There is ebook. There is not audio version yet, but I'm still hoping for that.
Great. Yes. And then I'll also mention, I think it's coming up. Are you involved with the Day of the Homeschooled Child at all? I think that's the end of April, isn't it?
Yes, that is the end of April. Yeah.
So that's being run
by. Yeah, that's something that's run by the Coalition for Responsible Home Education. It is at the end of this month, which is Child Abuse Awareness Month, and it's a specific day set aside to acknowledge and commemorate the lives of homeschooled children who we have lost, and to keep in mind that child abuse and neglect is something that happens everywhere, and that includes conservative evangelical spaces. Growing up homeschooled, myself and my peers often felt like we had to always put on a good face. We had to make sure that no one was able to judge us or look down upon us for being homeschooled. And so a lot of homeschool children felt like they couldn't talk about their negative experiences. And so the Day of the Homeschooled Child is just a day to acknowledge that those stories do exist. It's not anti-homeschool in any way. I myself am a big advocate and fan of homeschooling. I just think that it's really important, just like in all the things we're talking about with child liberation theology, in homeschooling too, that we have to make sure that what we're doing is child-centered, that it's putting children's needs and rights at the forefront, as opposed to being something that's just about parents and what parents want. We have to balance those wants so that we have a more equitable world.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. That's good. And that may be of interest. We'll share some more things on that on the 30th that may be of interest to people following along. Anything else you saw, Kelsey, or wanted to?
Well, I was just going to ask, now the book is out, where can people find, I know you're still writing and putting things out, where can we find your writing and work and what you're doing next?
Yes, thank you. My website is my name, so RL and then Stollar, STOLLAR.com, and I have a bunch of writings there. I have a whole section on child liberation theology, so if you want to learn more about that, there's a bunch of free stuff there. And then I also have a lot of writings on evangelical homeschooling, both like historical studies and commentary. And then you can also find me on Twitter at RL Stollar.
Great. Do you have another book in the works or anything? Are you thinking?
I am working on and then my next book will be on evangelical homeschooling specifically. So,
okay, yeah. Wonderful, great.
I'm hoping to take like all the stories that we gathered with Homeschoolers Anonymous and try to figure out a way to kind of condense and distill those into an explanation of what everyone went through, and kind of pair that with like a history of homeschooling.
Wow, awesome. I look forward to reading that.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us, and everyone following along as well. Thank you. Is it okay with you, Ryan, if we usually cross post to our YouTube channel once the lives are finished? Is that okay if it's on there and in our Instagram feeds? Wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah. Once you get it up, just let me know and I'll be sure to share it too.
Well,
sounds good.
Thanks to you both.
Thank you. Great conversation.
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Have a good day.
Everyone who joined.
Bye, everybody.
Take care.